Okay, so we've talked about the most often completed Notary Act. Now let's talk about the second most completed Notary Act. Before we begin to talk specifically about completing jurats, as with acknowledgments, I want to remind you that you must first examine the document for completeness. A jurat is used as a formal record of the document signer personally appearing before the notary and stating an oath or affirmation to the notary that the contents of the document are true and correct. Acknowledgments, of course, you'll remember, don't require this kind of an oath, but this oath is the essential point of completing a jurat. We say that the document signer either swears an oath or affirms to the notary that the contents are true. Jurat wording is usually found at the end of the document, just like acknowledgment wording, or attached to the document. Once again, the notary is not going to be required to guess what to do. The notary does not make the decision as to which notary act is to be performed because that's considered giving legal advice. If this wording appears at the bottom of the page or attached to the page, then the notary must administer a jurat. Now you'll notice this wording, which says subscribed and sworn or affirmed before me. This means that the document signer must not only be given an oath or affirmation, but that the signer must also sign the document in the presence of the notary. Now you'll remember that someone could have already signed an acknowledgement when they brought it to the notary, and the notary just simply asks, did you sign that document? In other words, the notary is asking them to acknowledge their signature. But a jurat is different. If a document that requires a jurat is brought before a notary and it's already signed, the process of the jurat will require that that document signer re-signs that document in front of the notary. The signer of a document requiring a jurat can be referred to as an affiant because he or she is signing an affidavit, or also called a declaration, before the notary, and an affidavit is really simply a sworn statement. A notary may not fill out jurat wording, sign the jurat statement, or place the notary seal image on a document unless the document signer first completes the oath or affirmation process and signs the document in front of the notary. Don't do this in reverse order. Make sure the document signer swears the oath or affirmation first, then signs the document, then you can complete the notary act. When the notary completes the jurat, the notary is certifying that the signer personally appeared before the notary on the date and in the county indicated, we've seen that before, that the signer was identified with satisfactory evidence, we've seen that before as well, that the notary did administer the oath or affirmation, and that the signer signed the document in the presence of the notary. By the way, if you're wondering what is the difference between an oath or affirmation, well, an oath uses the term God or higher power, and an affirmation simply omits that term, and that's really the only difference. Now, to complete the jurat process requires the notary to confirm the identification, administer the oath or affirmation, watch the signer sign the affidavit, complete the journal entry, as always, and finally complete the notary wording for the jurat. Then they'll apply the notary seal, and if the jurat wording happens to be on a different page, then the jurat must be attached to the document with a staple, just like we did with the acknowledgement. Now, of course, the signature on the document must be the date that the notary act occurred. If the document signer previously signed this affidavit in error, then the notary must require that the signature be placed on the document again while the notary is watching the signing. Obviously, then, the date of signing cannot be in advance or later than the jurat was completed. Okay, of course, as with the acknowledgement, once again, the notary should visually scan the entire document, and the notary act may not be completed if the entire document is not present or if it's incomplete. Now, the notary has flexibility over the wording it's used for the oath or affirmation, and, as I said earlier, may choose to use the term God or omit the term. Now, the document signer, or the person making the oath, often called the affiant, isn't really required to raise their right hand, but the notary often makes that request in order to make the event more formal, and it ought to remind the signer of the seriousness of making the oath or affirmation, especially as it's made under penalty of perjury. Of course, since the document signer must personally sign the document in front of the notary, clearly a jurat may not be completed for a document that's presented to a notary without the signer being present. Now let's take a closer look at the wording on a jurat. Of course, the jurat is either included at the bottom of the affidavit being notarized or at the end of the affidavit. Remember that we're using the term affidavit to describe the document as a way to remind you that the document which is to be signed is a declaration of fact and signed under penalty of perjury. So as you'd expect, the wording of a jurat is very different from the acknowledgement wording. Somewhere in this wording, we'd expect to see that the document signer is swearing or affirming the statement of truth to the notary, and that's exactly what we do see. Notice the terms subscribed and sworn. I know that we looked at this briefly before, but now you understand why this is such a critical part of the notary wording. Once again, also take notice of the venue. The venue is always where the notary act was completed and not where the document was drawn or where the document will be recorded. Secondly, notice that we're entering the date a little bit differently here than we did the acknowledgement. As a matter of course, anything you complete as a notary should never be abbreviated, including months of the year, and that's also the case with the jurat. If you're completing a jurat on the 13th of November, for example, you should write out the month and use the TH after 13. Now, the name of the document signer, who you'll remember is often referred to as an affiant or a declarant, goes into the next space of the jurat. Perhaps you recall that on the acknowledgement wording, the name of the notary came first after the words "before me," but the jurat doesn't have a place for the notary's name except for the signature. Now that's one way you can remember this. Once again, of course, the notary always signs his or her name using the name and signature that's on file with the county clerk's office, and that also has to match the notary seal impression. Now we're going to talk about another very critical difference here between the California acknowledgement wording and California jurat wording. California does allow for some different wording with acknowledgments if the document will be recorded or it's going to be used in a different state, so long as the wording doesn't require the notary to do anything illegal for a California notary. We've talked about that. But jurat wording in California must always be the same regardless of where the document is to be sent. If a document contains wording for a jurat from another state, and if that state's wording is different than the wording that's shown here, the notary may not complete that jurat, even if there are slight differences in the wording. And the notary shouldn't attempt to change the existing wording by crossing off the incorrect wording, but the notary should use a jurat with the correct wording in its entire form. Now, of course, when a notary notarizes a signature that requires a jurat, the notary is relying on the oath or the affirmation from the document signer concerning the truthfulness of the contents of the document. In other words, of course, it's not the notary's responsibility to go through that document to make sure that all those statements are true. However, there's one type of document called a self-certification declaration, or we might refer to it as an affidavit of identity. But basically, it's where the document signer is self-certifying their own identification. The point about this document is that it's a self-certification of someone's identity. Now, if you're required to notarize a signature that requires a jurat on this type of document, and if this document has the date of birth or the age of the person, and it has a thumbprint, fingerprint, or a photo of that person, then you are required to verify that age or birth date. So this is unusual because normally we are not required to verify any of the contents within a document, but with this special kind of a document, the only thing that we are actually required to verify is the age that's stated there or the date of birth. Now, we can do that by using any acceptable identification document like a driver's license, a passport, or some of the other identification documents we've talked about earlier. And if the person doesn't have an identification document available, then and only then can we use a certified copy of a birth certificate. Now notice, it's not just a regular old copy of a birth certificate, but actually a certified copy of the birth certificate. Now keep in mind, what we're using this certified copy of the birth certificate for is to verify age or the date of birth statement that's in this affidavit. So again, it's a kind of an unusual circumstance, but certainly one to remember and certainly one to know about.